Welcome to Not Your Ordinary Parts podcast, where we talk about hard things associated with the human experience with the goal of increasing awareness, growth, and healing. You may hear information from professional licensed therapists, life coaches, healers, doctors, etc. This information is not medical advice or therapy, and it's not meant to replace actual therapy or instructions given by a doctor or a personal therapist. I'm your host, Jalon Johnson. I am not a therapist. I don't have a background in psychology. I don't feel like I'm anyone special. I just made the decision one day that I wanted more, and I wanted to heal the things that I felt like I was hiding. So I started my journey, and what you're seeing now is a byproduct of that decision. And I hope that if anyone feels the same way, that this is interesting to them, and if they have that same desire, that this can be useful. My guest today is Dr. Christine Bishara. Okay, so I'm going to introduce Dr. Bishara properly. So you're going to need to take a seat because it's going to be a minute. I'm going to read her bio. So here we go. Dr. Bishara has over 20 years experience and is the founder of From Within Medical, which is a medical wellness practice that places its emphasis on the mind, body, and gut-brain axis to prevent and manage disease. Dr. Bishara has discovered that the connection between these systems plays a significant role in disease prevention and management, and her therapy includes a multidimensional and personalized approach that addresses multi-physical and biological factors, while focusing on strengthening the body's immune system, including individual gut health, determination of antioxidant levels, and determination of neurotransmitter deficiencies. Dr. Bishara also published the first scientific study on COVID severity and gut health. So I tell Dr. Bishara all the time that I think she's the smartest person that I know. And when she has on her white coat, she looks like a whole rocket scientist. So without any further ado, welcome, Dr. B. It's a privilege and an honor to have you as a guest. So thank you for being here and doing this with me.
Thank you so much for having me. And I want to correct you on that. Thank you for the nice compliment. But I wanted to clarify that I feel like society has kind of turned this whole, like, that person is smart and that person isn't, into something that I think is unfortunately probably not healthy for kids growing up, because I'm a big believer in, we all have certain types of intelligences. So when you hear me talking about the things that are related to gut health and wellness, it's because I'm really passionate about those. But I think we're all smart in our own way. And it's just trying to figure out what you like and hone in on that. And unfortunately, I think society and education really focus more on, that math and science brain, for example, as the smart one. Whereas I feel like we all really have different intelligences, and, you can see somebody who's artistic and not everyone can do that, or somebody who has a linguistic intelligence, or someone like a psychologist who has interpersonal intelligence. So I think there's all different kinds of intelligence. And I think we need to, as a society, kind of start really appreciating everyone's different intelligences and not really focusing on one type. So thank you for the compliment. But I think what we are passionate about is what we become really smart in. So.
Wow. I agree with that. I do. I still think you're smart. So,
yeah.
But,
pressure's on.
No, there's no pressure. I think that with your knowledge and expertise, that you can answer so many questions that a lot of us are struggling with in healthcare and with our primary care doctors and just the medical industry in general. So that's why I'm glad to have you here as a guest and to be able to ask you some really, hard questions that I think are plaguing a lot of us.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we've also become a society of quick fixes, where, we want quick fixes for everything, right? So if we don't feel well, instead of listening to our body and kind of trying to figure out what our body's trying to tell us, because our body really is ultimately, I say this all the time, is the best doctor. And it's always looking for our survival. And when things aren't going well, it will give us little clues and hints, with symptoms. And unfortunately, as a society, we've also become a society where instead of looking into the root cause of whatever symptoms we're having, we just kind of treat them with, quick fixes. So, and there's nothing wrong with medications. As a traditional physician, trained as an allopathic physician, I do believe that medications do play a large role in helping us. However, we have to start looking at root cause of our symptoms and our chronic illnesses and our issues, because they really are based on our lifestyle. And then as we proceed and look into those, if those aren't treated properly with lifestyle, then medications play kind of, in my opinion, a tertiary role instead of a primary role. So my goal as a physician is to really educate and help everyone understand their body, and everyone's body is unique. We just kind of have to tweak a little bit what you need versus what I need. So this is really where my practice was kind of born from, just my background in internal medicine and having practiced that for 20 years and seeing so many chronic illnesses in my patients that could be prevented from, simple lifestyle changes, simple things that we can all incorporate into our lives. We just unfortunately haven't been educated in them properly. So that's my goal and my passion through my wellness and my weight loss practice, is to really empower my patients with the knowledge and give them the tools that they need to kind of potentiate or maximize their best health.
I see. And if you don't mind, how did you develop your practice? And what was it that got you to this point?
Yeah. It's funny because I graduated medical school 25 years ago, and I've always been really passionate about nutrition and diet and lifestyle. And I would tell my friends, one day I'm going to open a weight loss clinic. And that was really I guess my passion again, right? My smart. And, it took me 20 years later to go through internal medicine and just to see everything. And maybe that was a good thing, because it kind of helped me appreciate the body as a whole and how we all are different. And so that's really where I guess my passion grew. I was an obese teenager, and I lost a lot of weight, kind of just experimenting with different things. But one of the things I had experimented with back then was intermittent fasting, which at the time, most people didn't really know what that was. But, having studied the pathways in medical school, I kind of put two and two together as to, what my body can probably do things differently, while I'm dieting and losing weight through fasting. And so now, we know that fasting has so many benefits for weight loss, but also for our immune health, for our gut health. And so I'm a big believer in fasting as part of that. But that's really where my practice and my interest in wellness and weight loss grew from. I think everyone that has a passion, it grows from an internal, struggle that they've had, right? And then once they kind of accomplish that, they want to help others. So.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for that. To kind of get into the meat and potatoes of the interview, I wanted to ask you a few questions. And the first is, why is everyone so sick, in your opinion?
Yeah, again, it kind of goes back to that quick fix that we keep talking about, is we're not doing things the way we used to do them, right? And I think the COVID pandemic was kind of a wake-up call for the US, right? Because we didn't really fare as well in terms of how we handled COVID, our bodies, how our immune systems handled COVID. So I think it was a wake-up call to kind of help us realize that, we're really not treating our bodies the way we should be treating them. And in fact, our bodies aren't able to heal and fight disease the way they should be. And I think a lot of that has to do with increased consumption of processed foods that has been so ubiquitous in our society, unfortunately. And I think it stems from the fact that we're all kind of pressured to do things a certain way, right? And then we just don't have time anymore to not only just eat properly, shop for foods properly, make time to prepare foods, but we're also not socializing the way we used to. And we know that the social aspect of eating makes a difference as well. We're also sleeping not enough hours, and that sleep deprivation is also causing havoc on our bodies, but we're also not relaxing like we used to. It's almost like we're all kind of running this rat race. And so the compounded stress, diet, lifestyle, lack of, proper exercise, I think all of those things compounded have, unfortunately caused us to get really sick. And, we need to kind of, reverse that. And the way to reverse that is very simple. It's a little bit harder work and it takes time, but, I think we're all, what's the word? We all deserve it, right?
Yeah, agreed for sure. Okay.
Yeah, because ultimately, if you're healthy, you're going to be healthy, you're going to be happy, you're going to feel great, and that kind of just ricochets into everything in our lives.
So you are what I consider a gut specialist. So another question would be, what is the gut and why is it so important?
Yeah. Our gut basically, if we're going to think technical terms, is, from our mouth to our anus, right? It's our whole GI intestinal tract. But what we've now realized is our gut plays such an important role in our overall health. And maybe it's something that we've realized now, but I think it's something that our ancient doctors probably knew more about. If you think about like Hippocrates, he practiced thousands of years ago. He's the father of medicine, but he knew that the gut played such an important role. He had a famous saying that was, make food thy medicine and medicine thy food. But he even termed a few conditions, like we talked about the gut-brain axis, but the term melancholia comes from, so if you think about melancholia, right, it's not feeling great, right? You're like, your mental health is not as great, but the term actually melanai, it's black stool. So he saw that patients, who had a lot of, like mood disturbances or mental issues, he noticed there was a link to the gut. So, we've kind of lost touch with our bodies, through the advancement of society, which hasn't necessarily been good for our bodies. So I think we need to start going back to the basics. And our gut, believe it or not, houses trillions of microorganisms that are working in a symbiotic relationship with our body. Now, we can feed our microbiome with good food that help to grow great organisms, like beneficial bacteria, or we can feed our body with food that isn't so good that helps to grow not so beneficial bacteria. So it's really up to us in how we allow our body to kind of help us. So if we're eating the proper foods, which are whole foods, plant-based foods, foods found in nature, then we're allowing the gut bacteria in our gut to thrive that are beneficial. And then in turn, they provide these wonderful byproducts that help with our mental health, help with, all other help decrease inflammation and so many things that they have an interaction with through our body. So we need to feed them properly so that they can, help us as well.
So
we're basically, we're human, but we have all these organisms that are living inside of us, believe it or not, that are actually in the symbiotic relationship with us.
Okay. So the gut and the microorganisms, the way they function, they also, I guess there's a line of communication with the brain. Is that the gut-brain axis, or what exactly is the gut-brain axis?
Yeah. Yeah. So, as I mentioned, we do have these microorganisms living in our gut, and they do communicate with our brain through different ways. They communicate through sending nerve signals, but they also, have produced something called postbiotics. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. So the organisms in our gut are called probiotics, right? So when somebody says take a probiotic, you're taking the organisms, right? The culture, and that's the probiotic. But we have our own probiotics, which are the microorganisms living in our gut. And so if we feed them properly with proper prebiotics, which are fiber-rich foods, right? Because they need to feed on that. So if you think about fiber-rich foods, our body can't digest fiber. It just doesn't have the capacity to digest fiber. But what it does is when we eat fiber-rich foods is it absorbs all the wonderful nutrients like the vitamins and the minerals and the antioxidants. And we utilize that. But then our bacteria feed on those fibers. And in turn, they produce these things that are really healthy for us. So these postbiotics that they produce, one of them is postbiotics that, believe it or not, send signals to our brain, satiety center. So there's a whole loop of that. There's also postbiotics that help to maintain our blood glucose levels. There's postbiotics that communicate with our immune system. There's postbiotics that help with keeping the gut lining healthy. So all of these wonderful byproducts that our microorganisms are producing are what really kind of keep our health in check. So of course there's the good benefits, but then if we have bad bacteria in our gut, those are kind of doing the opposite, right? Where it's like you're feeding a monster and it's never satisfied. And so then that causes inflammation. And we could talk a little bit more about leaky gut. I think, you've mentioned leaky gut in our conversations in the past, but I don't know if a lot of people know what leaky gut is.
Well, my next question was going to be about autoimmune diseases and an autoimmune response. And I know that, well, maybe you could explain leaky gut and then we can go right into what autoimmunity is.
Yeah, I mean, the two are kind of linked. So autoimmune diseases are basically conditions where we don't know the risk, we don't know the causes of them. And what autoimmune means that our immune system starts to build antibodies against ourselves. So our immune system doesn't recognize that what's going on in our body is from us, and it sees whatever's going on as foreign. So it tries to attack it and fight it. And unfortunately, that causes a release of these inflammatory responders. And these inflammatory responders are what lead to us developing autoimmune diseases. So it's almost like the body's fighting itself. And although we don't know what the cause of autoimmune disease is, a lot of research has now been focusing on the gut as one of the main risk factors for the development of autoimmune. And it's really mainly linked to the development of something called leaky gut. And so what does leaky gut mean? It means that our gut, right? We talked about the organisms that are living there, and every cell in our body has a membrane, right? And the membrane allows certain things in and certain things it doesn't allow in. And so our gut also has this barrier where it's a protective layer, and it shouldn't be allowing anything that's in the stool, right? Because we eat foods, our body digests what it can, it absorbs the nutrients from the foods that we're eating, and the rest come out in the stool. So the stuff that comes out in the stool is obviously not stuff that our body needs, right? It's toxic for our body. And this is how we eliminate waste. But unfortunately, what happens with leaky gut and with poor lifestyle changes and diet is if we're not feeding the bacteria properly, they're not going to be able to produce those great postbiotics that help to keep the lining healthy. And if your lining starts to break down, what happens is it starts to leak stuff out into your bloodstream that shouldn't be leaked out, right? We talked about that the waste is supposed to come out. But unfortunately, if that lining is not as protective because it's broken down, you're going to start having things that leak into the bloodstream. And our body is so smart. Again, always looking for survival. Its ultimate goal is to keep you healthy. So our immune system sees these things that are being released into the bloodstream, and our immune system sees them as foreign. And so it starts to develop this response, right? Because it's trying to fight whatever it thinks it's seeing as toxic. And that inflammatory response is what unfortunately gets us sick. And so if it happens once or twice, it's okay. Our body's very resilient. And this is what we talk about when we say acute inflammation. So acute inflammation is not necessarily bad, but what happens over time, if we're continuing to eat poorly, that breakdown of the lining continues to worsen, and we continue to have an inflammatory response that now becomes chronic. And so when you have an inflammatory response that's now chronic, our body is not able to handle things as well as it should be. And this is where we talk about that chronic inflammatory state. The best way I can think about it is if you've worked, 12-hour shifts 7 days in a row, you're going to be tired at the end of those 7 days, and you're not going to be able to function or do things the way you should be doing it, right? Because you're so fatigued. Well, our body's kind of the same way. If it's constantly releasing inflammatory markers and it's producing inflammation to try to help us fight whatever it sees as foreign, over time, chronic inflammation leads to the inability to handle things as well as it should. And this is what I think is going on with COVID, and why we as a society in the US didn't do so well with COVID, because I think so many of us are chronically inflamed. Many of us don't even realize that we have chronic inflammation. And I think this is why some people didn't respond to COVID the way that our body should have responded.
So the illustration you gave about, working long hours and being fatigued, that makes sense. And if there is that chronic inflammatory markers, then our body is going to be just tired. What would be some symptoms of leaky gut, or a gut that isn't, running on optimum levels?
Yeah. There are several things, and a lot of times, a lot of people don't even realize that they have an unhealthy gut, because some people can look on the outside like they're fine, but leaky gut usually starts with symptoms such as bloating. You can have symptoms of bloating or gas, for example. Leaky gut can also show up in the way that your skin looks. So there's the gut-brain axis, but there's also the gut-skin axis. So a lot of times, if you're starting to develop acne, or even eczema, or certain rashes, you have to start looking at the gut. And there have been some studies that link eczema to gut health, because there is that link. But then we talked about the gut-brain analysis. So another symptom could be brain fog that you're having, or how the gut interacts with our immune system, our metabolism. You can start developing a resistance to losing weight, because your body's immune system is in that hyperactive state all the time. And so that happens. And then unfortunately, your body is trying to protect you. So what does it do? It drops your metabolism as a way of trying to kind of keep things in check. So inability to lose weight is another one. Skin issues, bloating, mental fog or brain fog. Those are just a few symptoms that might indicate that you have a leaky gut. And then, over time, IBS is another one. You could start having irritable bowel syndrome, symptoms preceding inflammatory bowel disease sometimes also start with leaky gut. And then over time, the gut can become so inflamed that you develop inflammatory bowel diseases like Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis.
Now, you just mentioned inability to lose weight. And I think that when we're younger and our body is more resilient and isn't as tired, we may not see the progression of an unhealthy gut. But as we get to, a certain, people say once you get to 40, you're not going to be able to lose weight. And I never believed that. I always thought it was something else. And as I researched, I learned that there is more. If your gut is sick, or if you have what is referred to as metabolic dysregulation. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah. So metabolic dysregulation means that, again, something going on with our metabolism. Again, it's a protective mechanism that our body does, right, to think it's helping us. But again, when you have a leaky gut and inflammation in the gut, it starts to spread to systemic inflammation. And systemic inflammation, then unfortunately, the presence of that chronic inflammatory state is resistant to us losing weight, but it also causes an inability to lose weight, but then it can progress to diabetes, hypertension. And so all of these things really stem from inflammation. And we can talk about things like stress, for example, that can also impact the way that our body perceives inflammation. So I'll give you an example. Again, anything acute, so acute inflammation, acute stress, it's not bad for our body. It's when it becomes chronic that's where the problem kicks in. So if you think about when you have an acute stressor, for example, I'll just give you an example. You're in the forest and you're being chased by a bear. So what happens? This is an acute response. It's something that your body needs to respond to right away. So it releases noradrenaline, right? It's one of our neurotransmitters. And we all know noradrenaline is that fight or flight neurotransmitter, right? So what does it do? It helps us like speed up. It kind of like revs us up. But if you notice, like you also get that pit in your stomach, right? And a lot of people will get diarrhea. That's because the body is trying to focus on the main thing, right? So it's diverting blood supply from things that it perceives as it might not help it. You know, like if you're having to run away from this bear, right? Your body's goal is to have you run as fast as you can. So it doesn't want you eating right now because it doesn't want to, send that blood supply to the gut, right? It wants you to really focus on running. So sending the blood supply to your muscles, for example, so that you can run as fast as you can. So this is acute stress, right? And your body's way of really protecting you. But unfortunately, what happens is noradrenaline is great. It's a great neurotransmitter, but you can't release noradrenaline on a chronic basis because, that fight or flight, those symptoms that are, consistent with that, what do? They increase your heart rate, but you can't have your heart rate increase all the time because that can cause damage to your heart. So a lot of things with noradrenaline, prolonged release of it is not good for your body, and your body knows that. So then it decides, okay, the acute stressor is gone, but he's still under stress. His body is still under stress for whatever it is, right? So this is where we shift from acute stress to chronic stress. And this is really where we start having this metabolic dysregulation that you talk about, is now your body is always looking for survival, but now it needs to survive, not on a short-term basis by having you run away from that bear, but on a long-term basis, right? So now your body's thinking, okay, well, he's stressed. The stress isn't going away. I need to figure out a way to preserve energy so that if he needs this energy and he's not having access to food, I need to figure out a way to help him survive. So what's it going to do? It's going to release different inflammatory responders such as cortisol, or chronic inflammatory releasers such as something called interleukin-6, which is another big inflammatory responder that's present in a lot of people that are chronically inflamed. So what happens with cortisol is now helping you store fat. So you're not going to be losing weight as fast because that chronic inflammation is your body's way of trying to almost like prepare itself for the long haul of stress. So it's going to drop your metabolism. It's going to cause you to, hold on to that fat that, you might need as a reserve later on. But again, it's going to turn into chronic inflammation. And that chronic inflammation over time causes damage to cells. This is where we have diabetes developing. This is where we have heart disease developing. So chronic inflammation is detrimental because of that, because it slows the metabolism down and it leads to, factors that just keep that inflammation persistent. That makes sense.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. So stress we've always heard stress is a killer, but I guess when you break it down and you really look at it, the way you explained it, you can see why. Can stress also affect your hormones?
Stress can definitely affect your hormones as well. And actually, that's a really good point that you bring up. So cortisol, right? Cortisol is not a bad it's not bad, right? It's, it should be released in the morning. Like the best time to have cortisol release is early in the morning when you first wake up and you get that burst of energy and you're ready for the day, right? So, but what happens is we've noticed that cortisol per se is not bad, but the chronic release of cortisol where it's not going down, the levels aren't going down is what's bad. Because again, that cortisol that's chronically elevated then causes us to be chronically inflamed. So, so it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's more of that chronic stress. And I'm sorry, what was your question regarding that?
Can stress affect the hormones?
Yeah. So we have hormones that our body makes, right? So, there's the hormone precursor is called DHEA, right? And the pathway for
Hmm.
DHEA, it produces cortisol, it produces estrogen, it helps to produce testosterone. But what happens is, I'll just give you an example. If you're chronically stressed, that pathway that starts at the top with DHEA and should be, making all these hormones, it's going to start diverting more production of cortisol instead of testosterone or estrogen, for example. And so this is where you can start affecting your hormone levels. Is your body is just, it's like, I need more DHEA to produce cortisol. And so it's going to start diverting those pathways. But then we talk about people who are estrogen dominant, right? And this can happen in males where they start producing more estrogen. So if you're overeating, and you have too much fat in your body, believe it or not, your body turns fat into estrogen, a form of estrogen. There's several different forms of estrogen. One of them is called estrone. And so estrone is derived from excess fat. So that excess estrogen on the body is not healthy for us. Everything in moderation. Same thing with testosterone. If we're diverting too much of that DHEA where our body needs to make more cortisol, it's not going to be making testosterone. And so I always tell people, if you're taking things on the outside to help kind of increase your levels, so I know a lot of people will take like males that take steroids, right? They might bulk up, but eventually your body is seeing that your body's seeing that you're taking in these steroids. And so it's not going to make as much because of the fact that you're bringing it in externally. So it starts to kind of decrease what it's making on its own. And so that over time is what causes the problem, is that your body almost becomes lazy. And since you're giving your body that stuff externally, it's like, well, I don't really need to make as much of this anymore. And we've seen this even with medications like antidepressants. There was like a big study recently on antidepressants and how they don't really affect the serotonin. But what the mechanism of antidepressants is they cause your body to keep more serotonin in the system for longer. So if your body's keeping serotonin in the system for a little bit longer, what is that telling your body? Is, well, I don't really need to make as much serotonin anymore because it's here, it's present. So then that kind of causes like a negative feedback where your body starts to decrease its production of serotonin because it's already seeing that serotonin is present for longer periods. And then what happens when you start taking those antidepressants? Your body was so used to not making, right, the serotonin that it needs to. But also serotonin is another big one where we need to make it from precursors that are only present in food. So the precursor for serotonin is something called tryptophan. It's an amino acid.
Mm.
And amino acids are basically the protein building blocks of, hormones, neurotransmitters. And if we're not making that amino acids, we have to get it through food. And so tryptophan is only present in food. So if we're not eating foods that contain a lot of tryptophan, we're not going to be making as much serotonin. So that's going to affect, again, that's like a gut brain axis again. We're not going to be making as much serotonin. It's going to start affecting our mood. So, our body is the best doctor and its best survival. However, as a result of us mistreating it, or maybe not mistreating it, but not treating it the way it's supposed to be treated, we start developing all these chronic issues that, unfortunately sometimes can affect our health.
It seems like, from what you've explained, like the gut is literally involved in everything, and with the,
I think so, anyway.
the way, yeah, the foods that we eat or the foods that we don't eat, it seems like they play a huge role in our gut health. And a lot of people are saying probiotics and this and that and that and this. Do you recommend probiotics, and is it possible to heal the gut with just probiotics?
Yeah, I'm not averse to probiotics, but you can't probiotic your way out of an unhealthy gut. So the way that I see it is, again, right, it's like an easy fix, right? So
Right,
we
right.
can't take easy fixes for everything. I see probiotics as kind of like an adjunct or like the cherry on top. So you really have to start with prebiotics, the proper prebiotics, which are those fibers present in plant-based foods, because again, those are what are feeding our good gut microbes. And so when you're feeding them properly, they, we talked about this, they make the best byproducts for our body that start to heal us. They start to send signals to our satiety center. They start to control the immune system and how it regulates our immunity. So probiotics are a good adjunct, but you can't really just take probiotics. And the best probiotics, in my opinion, are the ones that are consumed. So prebiotics, but then probiotics like fermented foods are great. Foods that are providing probiotics naturally and you're eating them, those are really the best way to build your gut. And our gut is pretty resilient, believe it or not. If we start to change our lifestyle habits, it can also heal. We just need to identify what is going on in the gut. And then from there, use those tools to help heal.
What would you say is contributing? I mean, aside from, an unhealthy gut, metabolic dysregulation that we've already talked about, what are some other factors that are contributing to the rise in obesity that we see in our country?
Yeah, I mean, I think the past couple of years, unfortunately, we've all kind of taken two steps back, right? Because we haven't been able to exercise the way we used to. Again, I speak about stress and, our mental stress during the pandemic. I think everyone was stressed, but we also kind of lost touch with, that socialization aspect, right? And we know that socialization and being around other people is really important for our health. There are several factors that have kind of shown that. If you look at the blue zones, where that's an area in the world, it's 5 areas in the world where they've studied people there because they're the ones who have the highest percentage of people who live to be 100. And so they looked at the factors there to see what is it about these specific populations that are allowing these people to, thrive and live to such a long age. And it comes down to diet. So they eat a lot of plant-based foods, a little bit of animal protein, mostly seafood, but their diets are mainly plant-based foods. They eat a lot of olives and olive oil. And we've seen that also can have a really beneficial effect on our health. But they exercise, they socialize. These are factors that we can't undermine. Because again, the social aspect and that stress factor that plays a role in chronic illnesses is something that we really need to also focus on because it does really impact our health as well. There was another study, actually, it's called the Rosetto study that was done in the 1950s. And Rosetto is a town in Pennsylvania where they had a very, very low incidence of heart disease, and they couldn't figure out what it was because they found that the diet there was similar to the diets in other parts of the country where they were seeing a lot more incidence of heart disease. And so when they did a little bit of research there, they found that in this specific town, the majority of the people that lived there were Italian immigrants that all kind of came together. But what they finally concluded was the really main factor for the fact that these people lived healthy lives and didn't have the incidence of heart disease was the social aspect, where a lot of the households had members from different generations. So like the grandparents were living with the parents, and there was a really, really close socializing factor, but it was almost like, like the village, the people there were all very close and friendly, and they all really took time to spend time with one another. But in the household itself, grandma was cooking the meals and spending time with the grandchildren, and the grandchildren were spending time with the grandparents. And they found that was really the factor that distinguished Rosetto as a part of the country that, had this much healthier lifestyle. So,
wow,
it's interesting. It's called the Rosetto effect. Yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting because, personally, I wouldn't think that socialization is something that could be healing or would give longevity. And I guess maybe that's just because how fast paced our society is today. You know, we don't think about the small things or the simple things, you know?
Yeah. I mean, if you like, I'm sure you probably heard of those studies where they look at orphans, right? Like in an orphanage who weren't hugged or weren't touched for the first
Yes.
year of their life and how it really impacted them. And, there's a whole nother study called the ACE study that looked at children with childhood trauma, adults with childhood trauma, and how those specific adults that scored really high on this ACE study, which is a study that looked and saw how many factors of trauma that a person had in their childhood. And they looked at these people and they followed them, and they found that these people had a higher incidence of chronic illnesses, heart disease, so many other medical conditions that were, as compared to those that scored low in the ACE study, didn't have. So, stress, socializing, all of that play a huge role in our health. I mean, it encompasses all of wellness, really. So I'm a big believer in that anyway.
On the topic of wellness and healing, I know in your practice you use intermittent fasting. What does fasting do for the body, and why is it good for the immune system?
Yeah, so fasting, what we've started to see just with more studies coming out is threefold. It helps us to lose weight, right? So why do we lose weight when we fast? And I'm not speaking about eating, junk food during like whatever 6 or 8 hour period and then thinking you're going to lose weight. No, what I'm talking about is when we fast, we allow our body to tap into those secondary and tertiary survival mechanism that it's equipped with. I'll give you an example. So everybody's talking about ketosis and how wonderful ketosis is, which it is, right? Fueling your cells on ketones, which are burned fat cells, is very good. But a lot of people are taking ketosis in a way where they're just eating high fat, high protein. And while it may help you lose weight, it's not necessarily the best thing for your immune system over time. And so the way that intermittent fasting works in inducing ketosis, which ketosis is a great process, is it induces ketosis through the mechanism which our body was equipped to deal with, and it's survival mechanism. So for example, if you're not eating, like if you restrict your time of eating to, for example, 6 hours, and then you don't eat, your body knows that it needs to figure out a way to feed its cells, right? So if it's not feeding it through glucose, it has to figure out another way to feed the cells because they need fuel 24/7. So when you're eating, obviously it's easy, you fuel your cells through glucose. But when you're not eating, your body needs to tap into those, I call them like low battery mode survival mechanisms. So it puts itself in low battery mode and it starts to say, you know what, I need to be careful because I don't know how much energy I have. And so it starts to reserve energy for the most vital functions. So it starts to look at cells that might be getting a little bit old, might be getting dysfunctional, turning into cancer cells, and it starts to get rid of them. It kills them off. And this process is called autophagy. And it kicks in usually after about 20 hours of fasting. So for example, if you're starting to get rid of all these old cells through fasting, what's left is really, new renewed cells, right? Because your body kind of put itself in that low power mode to preserve the energy, and it's gotten rid of what it doesn't need. So that's the great way that it helps the immune system. But then your body also will kick into burning fat as a source of fuel, right? So we talked about ketosis. So how does it do that? So if you're not eating, it first starts to burn off stores of something called glycogen in the liver. And once it's burned that off, glycogen turns into glucose and fuels cells that way. And once it's gotten rid of that from the liver, and there's usually about 1,200 calories of glycogen stored in our liver, it will start to figure out another way to fuel its cells. And then that's when it goes to fat and starts burning fat cells so that the fat cells can provide fuel to our cells. And this is really our body's survival mechanism, but unfortunately, so many of us never allow our body to tap into that because we're constantly eating and we're not fasting. And we as humans have been made to fast to some degree, right? Because if we're constantly providing fuel for our body through glucose, our body's never going to utilize those other methods. And So immune wise, we're not getting rid of a lot of these cells that, might be dysfunctional, even those cells do have a lifespan of 120 days. And, you get new cells, but I'm just saying, like, if there's a cell that's maybe dysfunctional or kind of going, like awry, our body puts itself in that low battery mode to get rid of all these dysfunctional cells. So immune wise, that's what's going on. Weight loss, we talked about that and how it burns the fat. And once you start burning fat, you're losing weight. But the other great thing is it helps to heal our gut too. So, again, we talked about working 7 days a week, right, and not getting rest. You're fatigued, right? So the same thing's going on with your gut. If you're not giving your gut that time of rest, it's constantly working on digesting food, where the gut has so many other functions. I mean, a large part of our immune system is in our gut. So if we're really not giving our gut that time of rest through fasting, it's never going to have time to do other important functions. So intermittent fasting also helps with gut rest as well. And so then that helps to rejuvenate our immune system that way as well. So really, intermittent fasting, in my opinion, is great for so many things. I think a lot of people mistake intermittent fasting for fasting, and you're not eating anything for days. That's not what fasting means. Fasting means just giving your body that time of rest, whether it be 18 hours, 20 hours, or a little bit less, so that your body has that time to do other functions and your gut has that time to rest.
So would you, so let's say someone wants to start fasting or just dieting. And I know that the keto diet is popular. I know that eating, 6 small meals is popular. But if you're eating 6 small meals, do you really give your body a chance to rest? And would you recommend doing intermittent fasting as opposed to the 6 small meals?
Yeah. So, the concept of 6 small meals spread throughout the day, in my opinion, is not really healthy for your body, because you're constantly eating and you're constantly causing insulin to be released, right? So yes, I've had patients who ask me, well, can I eat 6 small meals a day instead of, two meals, for example, or 2 meals and a snack during fasting? And my response is, you can eat the 6 small meals, but make sure it's in a restricted time period, because the restricted time period is really where we're kind of rejuvenating our immune system and causing those other mechanisms to kick in, which is the fat burning. So while I prefer not as many meals, really what you're doing is restricting the time period so that your body has that time to rejuvenate immune cells and gut rest. But another thing with eating 6 small meals a day, and it does work for some people, so it's like a trial and error. But unfortunately, what happens is when you're eating that often, every time you eat, you release insulin. Your pancreas releases insulin, and over time, cells respond to insulin because we need insulin to help transport glucose into cells. But over time, cells almost start to kind of, I guess, kind of put it in like they ignore insulin after a while. Like it's like that boy who cried wolf phenomenon, where, that boy who cried wolf, the first time you take him seriously, second time also maybe seriously. And then every time you see him after a while, you're like, you know what, just leave me alone. It's kind of the same thing with cells, where if they're constantly seeing insulin spikes, they don't respond to insulin as well as they would if insulin wasn't released all the time. So that term insulin resistance starts to happen as a result of that, where cells start to become resistant to insulin. So this is where I start seeing it in people who don't restrict their time of eating or are eating all day long. This is what actually happens. So if you want to do the 6 small meals a day and they're within like a caloric restriction, it's probably fine if it's within a restricted time period.
Well, you've given so much good information. One of the last things I wanted to ask, because I don't want to take your whole day. You've been super gracious with your time. So the study you did on COVID and gut health, you were actually one of the first to do it, right? Or you were the first?
I think it might have been the first published study on the links between bacterial deficiencies in the gut and COVID. Yeah. And it was kind of like this, it was kind of like this light bulb moment that kind of just fell in our laps. I live in New York, and early on in the pandemic, we kind of got hit pretty early. It was one of the first few states to get hit, and so my practice was deemed non-essential, so it shut down. My husband's a pulmonologist, critical care physician, so he had the opposite effect where they had all the critical care doctors kind of like thrown onto the front lines in the ICU, managing these really sick patients. And so we'd have these conversations where he would talk to me about his patients in the ICU. And, how we talked about chronic inflammation. Well, a lot of his patients had elevated inflammatory markers, like very elevated. And he was starting to notice a trend that these were the patients that were getting very sick in the ICU. And a lot of them did have chronic illnesses, but then a lot of them also were just patients who may have had just an elevated BMI, but they had these high inflammatory markers. And what we started to research was, why are certain individuals more prone to COVID severity, but also why aren't kids really getting sick, right? So we started kind of focusing on children's guts and comparing them with those high risk people, right? Overweight people with chronic illnesses. And we started to notice a vast difference in the guts of children versus these people who were getting really sick. And, you mentioned it earlier about children being healthier, right? Their metabolism's good. It's because their immune system is pretty robust when they're younger, and most children aren't in chronic inflammation unless they have, a lot of other illnesses, but most children are not in a chronic inflammatory state. Their immune system is very robust, and they're born with, an innate immune system, right? It's your immune system, but then over time they develop an adaptive immune system. And how do they develop that? Well, they're exposed to different things in the environment that help to strengthen their immune system. But when you look at a child's gut versus an adult gut, it's actually pretty different. And the majority of the bacteria that's in their gut is a bacteria called bifidobacterium. And in children, up to 60 to 80% of their gut is this one microbe. And so we started thinking maybe there's something here that's causing them or protecting them. And so we started comparing children's guts in previous studies to people who are getting really sick. And what we found was the same people who were getting really sick from COVID were very deficient in bifidobacterium. And so we started kind of putting things together. Not only that, but bifidobacterium is a very potent immune regulator. So it's in almost every probiotic for a reason, because it's been so well studied. But it downregulates those same inflammatory pathways that my husband and his colleagues were seeing were very elevated in patients with COVID in the ICU. So what happens if you're a child and you get COVID, you have so much bifidobacterium in your gut that as soon as you see or it sees COVID, those inflammatory pathways don't have a chance to mount, right? So right away it's downregulated, and they're able to mount that proper inflammatory response through the downregulation of these markers. And then they usually have a very short course of COVID. But with people who don't have a lot of this bacteria, they're already in a hyperimmune, hyperinflammatory state. So their body's already tired. Their immune system's already tired, right? So when they get a COVID, it's almost like their body just kind of already has these really high inflammatory markers, and it just goes into overdrive, and it doesn't know how to tone it down. And so they get really sick because, again, like with autoimmune disease, for example, it's our own body against itself. That's exactly what happens when you're infected with COVID and you're already hyperinflamed, is your body goes into this overdrive where those inflammatory releasers are actually causing more damage to your cells. And, this is something you may have heard the term cytokine storm. It's cytokines are basically inflammatory markers that are released by our immune system. And when they say a cytokine storm happens in these really sick people, it's because there's a flood of inflammation going on, and these people are already clinically inflamed to begin with. So that flood of inflammation causes the damage to the organs, and that's what causes the problems with the breathing and the lungs. So it's that chronic inflammatory state where the body can't recover because it's too inflamed to be able to kind of mount a response properly to COVID, versus kids that are able to recognize the virus. The bacteria downregulates these inflammatory pathways right away, and they're able to kind of respond quickly and effectively.
So
when we said this, we had a little bit of speculation And
Mm-hmm.
I guess there wasn't like a lot of traction on it, but we're now almost 3 years in, and now so many studies have come out that link gut health to COVID severity. But specifically now, at the time when we did our study, it was just a review study because we weren't allowed in hospitals at all because of the restrictions. We weren't allowed to go in and study the stool of patients that were in the ICU. We kind of came to this conclusion just based on our data that we had studied from previous studies. But since our study was published, there have now been several studies that have actually looked at the stool of patients in the ICU with COVID, and they found deficiencies of bifidobacterium in these patients. So now we're kind of linking, in medicine, there's research, but then you have to kind of back up your research with clinical trials, right, to show the effect. So our study was more of like a hypothesis, and at the time we just wanted to release it quickly so that we can, recommend people to take probiotics, really high dose probiotics with bifidobacterium to help in that acute phase. But as we're now seeing with more and more studies, is that deficiencies of this particular bacteria are actually what's putting some people at risk.
So if being deficient in bifidobacteria, is that it? Okay.
Yeah.
If being deficient in bifidobacteria could cause your severity of COVID to be worse, would it cause you to be able to get the flu or a cold, or, so if that's true, then, I mean, the gut really is your immune system or your defense.
It is. I mean, a large portion of our immune system is actually in our gut. But, while you're saying this, when we were doing research for our study, we started to look at different patient populations. We know for a fact now that patients who are overweight and obese are deficient in bifidobacterium or have lower levels. The levels of bifidobacterium start to decline slowly as we age, and they're low in patients who are elderly. But believe it or not, we came across one study that looked at Chinese and Italian centenarians. So these are people who live to be 100. And there was a study that looked at their gut, and they found that these patients had higher bifidobacterium levels than the non-centenarian elderly population that they were compared to. So it's not impossible to, keep your bifidobacterium levels high. They naturally decrease over time, but we can increase our bifidobacterium levels naturally through eating of fiber-rich foods. Because again, those prebiotic fibers are what feed bifidobacterium. Eating fermented foods that have already probiotic-rich foods, again, will increase the levels of bifidobacterium in our body. And there's actually an interesting study that came out recently on ivermectin and how that works, because, there have been kind of like some controversy about ivermectin and how it helps with COVID. So I had done some reading up on ivermectin and the mechanism of action. And so it actually, the mechanism of action that it has is it downregulates one of these inflammatory markers that we talked about, interleukin-6, which is very high in patients who are sick from COVID. And so we found that one of the mechanisms of action is it downregulates interleukin-6. But a really interesting study that came out recently by a gastroenterologist named Dr. Hazan, she actually looked at ivermectin, and her study linked it to, believe it or not, ivermectin increases bifidobacterium levels. So people that were taking ivermectin and improved, it was because it was working on increasing bifidobacterium levels in the gut. And that's how it downregulated interleukin-6. So it's really interesting how everything kind of comes together. But, I tell everyone, bifidobacterium is the MVP of COVID. If you had enough bifidobacterium in your gut, you survived COVID. And if you didn't survive COVID, unfortunately, it was because probably your gut didn't have enough of this bacteria. And I know for me to say this, it's very controversial, right? And most doctors don't want to put their neck out. But I personally think that as we progress, we are going to see how important the gut plays a role. But I'm pretty sure that we are going to have more studies coming out about the benefits of bifidobacterium.
Mm. So with all of the information you've gathered and the studies that you've done, have you put this into your practice? And if so, what are some programs that you offer that someone could work with you to improve their gut health and to, improve their metabolic state, boost their metabolism, and if they are insulin resistant, to kind of break free from that.
Yeah, I mean, again, it sounds simple, but it really does start with the gut. The gut microorganisms are constantly changing. So if you travel, your gut microbiome will change. But what we have seen is that there are certain beneficial gut microbes that are present and that we'd like to be present in a gut. But also, I look at gut analysis because we've seen that the diversity of organisms, beneficial organisms in your gut, does link to your overall health. So the more diverse your gut is, the better your gut is. So we've seen that with now studies coming out linking Parkinson's, linking Alzheimer's to low gut diversity. So what I do is we try to look at the gut to see how diverse the organisms are. But then we also look to see, are you producing enough of those postbiotics that we know are so healthy for you, right? Is your gut producing enough of those? And if not, then we focus on diet, where we really try to help you not only increase your beneficial gut microbes, but also help you with producing those postbiotics, which come as a result of increasing the beneficial bacteria. And the way that we do that is through changes in your diet. We know that, plant-based foods definitely help the growth of beneficial microbes, but also increase the diversity. So the more different plant-based foods you're eating in a week, the better off you are. And we usually aim to have a variety of about 20 to 30 a week to help with that gut diversity. That's one thing we do in our office, but we also we do a gut brain analysis where we're all different, right? So we look and see what are your neurotransmitters that your body is making more of than somebody else, for example, but also, are you deficient in any? Is this why you're having certain symptoms? So we talked about serotonin a little bit and how the precursor is in food. So maybe you're not making enough serotonin and this is affecting, your brain fog, or maybe you're not making enough GABA, for example. And GABA is one of the neurotransmitters that helps to keep us calm or relaxed. So people that might be deficient will start to feel a little bit of anxiety or a little bit of stress where they weren't feeling that before. Or brain fog is another symptom. So we really, again, your body is just the best doctor, but we need to identify how to help your body. And this is really where I focus on my patients' health, and it's all personalized, and it's, you are different from my next patient, my next patient, my next patient. So, we're all different, right? So we all have different needs, and that's what I identify. And then based on that, we work on creating a lifestyle that will help you lose weight, but also, improve your health.
And gut health specifically.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where, so if somebody, was like, that's it, I really want to get healthy, where, and they want to work with you, where could they find you online or on social media?
They can email me, but I do virtual exams. So what I can do is a virtual wellness evaluation where we kind of just identify things, or I do have like a weight loss program where we can actually do everything virtually, and then we're keeping in touch and just kind of tweaking until we figure out the best formula for you. And so, that's where.
Where could they email you though? Or like your website, your web address, or?
Yeah, so they can go to my website, fromwithinmedical.com. I'm also on social media, Dr. Christine B. Yeah.
Okay. I want to say that I'm very grateful for what you do and how you do it, because I spent half of my life, seeing quote unquote specialists, and, I've had so many tests done to my gut that were, non-conclusive, or you're fine, or, I was given a stool softener from the last specialist I saw, and I was just over it. And it wasn't until I started dabbling in internal medicine and functional medicine that I got real answers. So to be able to do this with you and to, maybe provide someone who was in the same situation as me with an option or some answers, it means a lot. So I'm very grateful for your time and for who you are and what you do and the way you do it. So I want to be very, very gracious and, express my gratitude to you. So thank you so much, Dr. Bishara.
Thank you for having me. I think we're all, like I said, we're all different, and we just need to kind of figure out what works for us. Because when our body gives us symptoms, it's our warning sign. Instead of, let me just dampen this with, a quick fix. It's really our warning sign to change things. So.
And I think if we look at a symptom as a warning sign or as a way of our body communicating with us, then we can get to the root cause instead of just putting Band-Aids on things over and over. Because if we just keep treating the symptoms instead of the root cause, we'll never get better. And I believe that is what I had been doing for so long, and I was just spinning my wheels.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you said is pretty accurate. Is our body is communicating with us. It's trying to tell us something. So instead of not listening and just saying, like, quiet down, I'll take care of this, let's try to figure out what it is that it's trying to tell us, right?
Right, exactly. So
yeah,
thank you for being passionate the way you are. And I look forward to being able to share this and hopefully being able to give someone else some answers. So thank you for your time, and thank you for being my guest. I'm really, really grateful.
Appreciate it.